Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting the legendary Lieutenant Titus for Warhammer 40,000 by Games Workshop. Now, as the star of Space Marine, Space Marine 2 and also recently No Fear from Secret Level, this character is becoming a real fan favourite and an iconic example of an Ultramarine Space Marine in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So in this video what we're going to do is show you a great method of painting him from start to finish, covering all the details on the model, which means that this guide is not only great for this figure but also any Ultramarine you might want to paint. So we hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. So to paint Lieutenant Titus, or indeed any Ultramarine you might want to paint, what you'll need to do is start out with an undercoat to help all your paint stick to the miniature. And I've chosen to go for a grey undercoat here. This is Mechanicus Standard Grey from Citadel, and that's because a grey undercoat I find to be a really good go-to colour for just about any miniature you might want to paint. So if you're looking to keep costs down, it's a great starting point no matter what faction you're doing. However, if you are painting Ultramarines exclusively, you might want to think about getting a can of blue spray paint, and Citadel do make the colour Macragge Blue. This is an ideal starting point if you have access to it. But no matter what colour you choose to start out with for the undercoat, the first step needs to be the same, which is to paint the miniature with your chosen version of the blue that you want for the Ultramarines. Now this is important, especially if you happen to have undercoated your miniature with Macragge Blue, for example, because if you make any mistakes later on, if you have to clean up on that blue armour, you'll see the difference between the spray application and also the paint-on version of that colour. Even though the colour might be the same, the finish will be different and this stands out like a sore thumb. So it's good practice just to make sure your miniature is initially painted with your paint-on version of that blue. Now in our case, of course, the miniature is grey, so we've got to do this. So the colour I've picked out for it is marine blue, so a nice deep blue, ideal for Ultramarines. And what we want to do is go for a rough base coating brush to get started with. So the one I've got here is a medium base coat brush from Citadel, and with this just going to get a bit of water on it, use it to thin that paint down so it's nice and smooth, and then all we need to do is paint this all across the armour. Now on this initial step, I'm not at all concerned about any details that aren't going to be blue. So as I apply this, for example, we've got this loincloth, which later is going to be white. Doesn't matter at all if I catch it. But what is important is to make sure that we get all of the blue armour. So just take your time, working the colour into all the nooks and crannies. And once you've finished that first coat, apply a second thin coat in the exact same way to ensure a nice smooth finish before you move on to the next step. Once you've got a nice even finish to that blue armour, the next thing to do is begin the process of applying base coats on smaller details, and here we're looking for all the ones that can share a black wash. So the next one's going to be anything that's going to be silver. What you need to do is pick out a good strong silver here. So I'm using some Cerakote silver, and to apply it I've chosen to go for a size 0 brush from Artis Opus. So basically a medium to small brush with a good point on it. Really, any brush of this kind of size would be absolutely fine. So for example, if you want to go for a Citadel brush, a medium layer is going to be great for this sort of thing. Whichever you choose, just make sure you get that paint thinned down, and then it's time to start looking around the miniature for anything that needs to be this colour. So for example, on the weaponry, it's going to be a fair amount of details here, such as on the chainsword, where we're looking at things like the teeth just here, and also the motor just around here. Now, as you get close to any details that need to remain blue, you do need to be careful, and so that's why it's a good idea to have a brush that holds a good point, because for example, if we take a look around here, there's very small details, such as this little plug that we've got on his leg, where we just want to carefully go in and just pick that out. Titus also has these chains around his forearm, and these can be a little bit tricky to navigate, so just take your time on these areas, being as neat as possible as you get close to the blue. Once you're happy with all those silver details, we can then move on to a few more base coats before we do that black wash. And what we'll do is start out by picking out all the black features. And here, if we use an off black, so basically super dark grey, when we put that black wash over it, what we'll get is some shading and some depth. So for that reason, I'm going to be using some Death Reaper for these features. Now, once that's done, there's then a number of red features that we need to pick out on Titus. And here I'm going to use some Sanguine Scarlet, so a good base coat red for that one. And then there's got two shades of brown that we need to do. The first is going to be for the leather, and here we want a slightly orangey kind of brown. So I'm going to use some Noble Steed brown here, but then we've also got to paint his dark brown hair, and here you want a dark warm brown. So for this example, I'm going to be using Cuirass Leather here. But first of all, what we need to do is base coat all the black features. So I'm using some Death Reaper here, and I'm going to stick to the same brush to apply this. So that's size 0 once again. And as usual, make sure the paint's thinned down and ready, and just load up your brush, just being careful not to have tons of paint on here this time, because we've now got a few smaller features to pick out. And that's going to be things such as the joints in the armour, some of which can be quite tricky to get to. So for example, there are the joints right here. You can see having a finer brush like this with a good point really helps out with access to areas like that. But keep an eye out for all the soft joints in the armour plates. There are some around the body, on the back of the limbs, all that kind of thing. We just want to make sure we block all of these in. But then also, we've got lots of black to do on the weaponry. So for example, on the chainsword, the main part of it just here needs to be black at this stage. As you block this in, just be careful of the silver as you encounter it. Next up, it's time to move on to base coating the red details, and here what you'll need is a good strong red for the base coat, so I'm using some Sanguine Scarlet, and the first thing to do is paint the grip of his chainsword, but then also, if you look over on this shoulder pad, we do have the lieutenant marking, and in this case what we need to do is pick out this almost sunburst that we've got just around here, just being really tidy as we get close to that blue. Next up, it's time to base coat the leather details, so here you want a leathery brown, and the one I picked out for this is Noble Steed Brown, and with this we need to base coat the holster, so around here, but also we've got his belt to do. When you're doing the belt, just take your time as you work around all the colours that we've blocked in so far, and be sure to make sure you pick out the pouches that appear around here underneath the backpack as well. And then finally, it's time to base coat Titus's hair with a dark brown. So here I'm using some Cuirass Leather, and at this stage I'm not concerned about catching the skin, it's just a matter of making sure that all the hair is blocked in with this colour at this stage. With that done, we've now finished applying all those base coats that can share the black wash, so it's time to apply that black wash, and here it's your choice as to which one you go for. I've picked out some Oblivion black wash, and no matter which one exactly you're using, the application is going to be the same sort of thing here, with two main stages to it. What we'll do is start out by doing some shading on the armour, and then move on to everything else. But beginning with the armour, in this case I recommend going for quite a fine brush. So here I'm actually using a size 00, but if you want to go for a Citadel brush, then going for a small layer is ideal. Basically what we want here is a fine brush with a good point on it. Because for the armour, where we've got these large open spaces, what works really well is to paint it into the recessed details, so to keep everything nice and clean. So what you should do is just load up, making sure you've got a fairly good point on your brush, and then on the armour, it's time to start looking for all the recessed panels. So if we take a look at this leg around here, this is a great example of it, where we've got this recess just around here on the knee pad, and what I'm going to do is just introduce that black wash into the deepest area of it, by just running it gently into that part there like that. And the same on the top where we've got this little part sticking up, we just go around there like that, and then the same on this side here. Now it's also a good idea to go around the decorations at this stage to help define them. So you can see we've got this wing design just here. What I'm going to do is just make sure I run that wash into the corner. Because we've not painted this yet, it doesn't really matter if the wash splashes onto the flat of it, but we do want to make sure we get into that corner that goes around where this meets that blue. So just there, like that. Now once you finish doing that on the blue armour, the next thing to do is to apply the wash over the other colours that we've done so far. In this case, what we can do instead, because we want to darken these down and there tends to be quite a bit of texture, we can simply apply the wash all over them. So it's still Oblivion black wash, but I'm now going up to a regular size brush. So this is a size 1, about the same size as a medium layer from Citadel. And with this, just load up and paint it directly over these other colours. So for example, on the pistol just here, we've got the silver and the black. And what I'm going to do is just wash it directly over the top like this, just letting it settle and run into the recesses as we go along. And here we have the model with all that shading now applied. So with that done, we can move on to the next phase, which is going to be to introduce the gold onto the miniature. And here what we want to do is start out with a nice rich tone for the gold for the base coat. I'm going to use some Dragon's Gold here. And then for that really nice warm tone that the Ultramarines have with their gold, what you want is a warm brown wash. So I'm going to use some flesh wash in this case. We need to start out with the base coat. So I'm using Dragon's Gold, and to apply it, I've returned to my size 0 brush. And here you just want a good fine brush that's got a nice point on it, because here we need to be accurate as we block this in. Because essentially here we're looking for lots of decorations, and there are quite a few on Ultramarines, so you'll need that control as you follow them around. So as usual, get that paint thinned down and ready, and then we can start looking for these features. The first thing to do is going to be painting the rims of the shoulder plates. And when doing this, what I like to do is make sure there's not loads of paint on the brush, approach with the side of it like this, and just very lightly skim across the raised area. And this way the brush can only focus on that raised part, so you get a nice neat line as you block that in there like that. And just change the angle of the miniature as you need to make sure you're comfortable as you follow this all the way around. Besides this, it's really decoration that we're looking for. So for example, we've got the design on the chest. We want to make sure that we get all of this, just being careful to work the paint into all the texture as we go. On the weaponry, it's going to be some small features too, such as the pommel on his sword, just around here. And once you've found all of that gold, the next thing to do is apply a wash over the top. So as I mentioned here, you need a warm brown. So I'm using some flesh wash, and you just need to neatly apply it, making sure just to keep it on the gold. So for that reason, I'm sticking to my size 0 brush for this application. Now the wash is dry, you can see we've had a big change in the metallic and that we do have all the shading there now, but it has dulled it down. But don't worry about that because we will return that metallic shine to it later on. But before we do so, we've got some more base coats and washes to do. And what we're going to look at now are the purity seals and also a tiny bit of bone that appears in the miniature. So for the wax and seals, what you'll need is a Burgundy. And I picked out some Sword Hilt Burgundy for this. Then for the parchment and also the bones, you'll want a darker bone colour. And here I'm going to use some Dragon Fang. Now once those are on there, we need to wash them like we've been doing with the other base coats. But this time what we'll want is a dark brown wash. So here I'm going to use some Battlemud wash. But we'll start out with the Burgundy that we need for the Purity Seal wax. So here I'm using Sword Hilt Burgundy, and to apply it I'm going to be using the size 0 brush again, so a good size for this sort of feature. Once that paint's thinned down and ready, we just need to start looking out for these details, and what I'm talking about are these seals right here, where we need to look for the wax part of it and just block it in at this stage. Next up, it's time to base coat the parchment, and here it's good to go for a darker bone colour. So here I'm using some Dragon Fang, again applied with a size 0 brush. What we're aiming for first of all is the parchment that comes out of the purity seals, but there's also this piece of stylized parchment designed here on the shoulder plate, so I want to make sure that we get this too. Also being aware that it does have a secondary layer just going up on the sides around here, for example. And then finally, there is a bone inside a relic that we need to pick out too, and that is right down here, so be sure to get this at this stage as well. And once you're happy with those base coats, we're then ready to apply a wash over these two colours as well. In this case, what we need is a dark brown wash. So I'm using some Battlemud wash, applied again with a size 0 brush. All we need to do is paint it directly over the Burgundy and all of this bone colour. With the wash drying those features, it's now time to move on to the next base coat, and this one's going to be for the white details. And here what we should do is base coat with an off-white, which then gives us room later on to highlight with a pure white. And so whilst this might seem a little bit strange considering these parts are white, what it means is that we're going to get much more depth and definition in there. So the colour I picked out for this is Ivory Tusk, so a light ivory colour, and to apply it I'm going to stick to my size 0 brush, and with this there's just some select areas that we need to block in. Now, because we're going from a fairly darkish grey and darkish blue on the areas that we got here over to a near white, it does mean we're going to have to gradually build this up. So just expect to have to apply a colour like this in maybe 2 or 3 thin coats, but it is important that you keep them thin so that you retain the smoothness on these parts. So with the paint thinned and ready, we can start looking for them. And the first part that's going to be white is actually this knee just here, which does have a U, which is sort of extruded out from it. So as you block this in, just be as neat as possible to work around that U to make sure it stays blue as you do it. So we're looking at areas such as around here. Then there is some fabric to do. And what we're looking at is this part right here, the one on the front. And then we've also got the one that appears on the back around here. I finished building that colour up to an even finish there, you can see on the front, and we've also got it on the back too. So now we can do some shading on these parts, and this time instead of using a wash, instead I'm going to use one of Citadel's contrast paints, even though I am using it for the same sort of reasons in the same way as a wash. Basically I'm going to use some Apothecary white, which is a very sort of pale greyish blue colour, and by applying this over the top, what it's going to do is run into the recesses and give us shading, but it's going to be a very sort of clean, almost shell blue-like sort of shading. So to apply it, I'm going to be sticking to that same brush, the size 01. It's a good size for this application here, and all we need to do is get some of this onto the palette. Don't need to worry about thinning it down with any water or anything like that, but instead just make sure you don't have tons of it on your brush so it doesn't go out of control. When you're ready, it's just a matter of painting this directly over these features. So if you take a look at the loincloth here, all I'm going to do is just paint it straight over the top, letting it run into those creases and give us that shading. And with that contrast paint dry, we've now got some shading on those white details, and we'll come back to them later on to clean them up and highlight them. But now what we need to do is move on to painting his head, because if like us, if you glued on that head that isn't wearing a helmet, you'll now need to paint his skin. So to do this, what I'm going to do is start out with a base coat of Barbarian Brawn, so a nice sort of deep flesh tone here. Then we can move on to a wash for it for some shading and some warmth, and here I'm going to use that flesh wash. But to start out with, we need the base coat, so I'm using some Barbarian Brawn, and to apply it, I'm going for my size 0 brush once more, and for this first step, all we need to do is block this in. Now I do need to be careful about the hair and also about the gorges on his armour, because it is very high, so it can get in the way. So as you're doing this part, just really take your time and just be careful as you get close to the hair up around here, but also as you go further down towards his chin around here. And with that base coat done, we can then put a wash over this colour too, and here I'm going to be using some flesh wash. And with this, all we need is a thin coat across all of the flesh, and to do so, I'm applying it with that size 0 brush once more. Once that wash is completely dry in the skin, we can then move on to the next step, which at this stage is going to be some layering and highlighting on the skin, because personally I always find at this stage of painting the miniature, completing the face on them adds loads of character and life to the model, and it's really encouraging to then push through to complete it. So that's why I like to do this kind of thing now. So what we're going to do is layer the skin now, and here we'll need a bit of a lighter tone than we used for that original base coat. So I'm going to be using some Dwarven Skin for this, and then once that's been applied, we can move on to an even lighter one than that for a highlight. Here I'm going to use some Elven Skin. But we'll start out with Dwarven Skin, and to apply this one I'm going right down to my smallest brush, so it's a size 00 this one. If you wanted to go for a Citadel brush, I'd recommend a small layer brush here, and this is just because it can be a little bit tricky to get into the face in this miniature because of things like that high gorget. There's various details like his arms are kind of across his body, so having a brush like this with a fine point on it really helps out with the accuracy as you work out approaching the face. What you need to do with this paint is just thin it down so it becomes a little bit translucent on your palette. So you can see I'm bringing it down to about that point there, which if I load up, then paint it thinly on the palette, you can see straight through it to the paper beneath. So that's the sort of thing that we're looking for here, because doing this allows us to build up that colour on the skin, just add volume to things. So once you've got it thinned and ready, just make sure you have a small amount on your brush and you've got that good point there, and we can start applying it onto the skin. And the goal here is to apply it onto the raised up areas and the flatter areas whilst avoiding the deepest recesses only. So for example, if we start on the nose and just run down there, go up the side, you can see now it's gradually building up. But we've got a very deep recess where it then meets the cheek just here because of the expression on his face. So what I'm going to do is just skip past the darkest area and carry on again just beyond it, then following it down on that relatively smooth area just there, just beneath the cheekbone, so just down like that, but being careful of that deep recess we've got just above the mouth there. We want to retain that so the expression really comes through. Further up on the head, we've got things like the brow, where again we just want to make sure we follow the brow here, and there's a bit of a deeper recess directly above it, so I'm just going to skip past that and carry on just here. Now, once you've done that first coat, you can see it's not actually that much brighter than the original base coat was, but that's ideal because it's that translucency really playing in there. It means we can then go in with a second coat, and this one we can focus ever so slightly more towards the raised areas. So this time when we're doing the cheek, instead I'm just going to focus more towards the top of it here, and the result is that we get more of a gradient happening now. Same on the forehead, where I can just skip a little bit away from that recess and start here this time. And again, you can see it just builds up that volume there of the colour on the skin. So now what I'm going to do is carry on doing this across all the flesh, just being as neat as possible to gradually building it up. And once we've done so, we can then move on to a highlight. By building up that colour in that gradual manner, you can see now we've got some nice definition on the face, so we can take it further with a highlight now. So here what you'll need is a lighter skin tone. So I've got some Elven Skin for this, and I'm still applying it with the size 00 brush, and this time we just need to be even more selective about what parts we're picking out. So by and large, I'm going to be following the sharpest features of the face and the bone structure. So for example, here I'm just going across the brow, also picking out some little bits just here where we can add some wrinkles by just adding a few lines on here, just thinly applied, just to suggest those wrinkles like that. Now the paint's been thinned in the exact same way as the previous step, so this first pass is again going to be quite thin. It's not going to jump out too much, but this means we've got a nice foundation to build upon for a second coat, where we can just return to where we've originally applied it and just focus just a little bit more towards the parts that stand out. So the tip of the nose, this little point just above the eye right in here, and also this sharpest bit of the cheekbone right there. And with that, the skin's now fully highlighted. And so what we're now going to do is just add a few little extra features on there. And the first of these is going to be to add some stubble, so some 5 o'clock shadow to make him look all grizzled. And to do this, what you'll need is a darker grey. I'm going to use some Dungeon Stone grey for this. And what we need to do is thin this right down so it becomes a glaze. So what we're going to do is just get some water and put it next to the grey on the palette and just start drawing in a bit of that colour and create a very, very thin version of it, you see. So quite watery is what we're looking for. Now, once you've got that mixed like that, if you just load up and go straight in like that, there'll be too much on your brush and it'll swamp the area. So what you need to do, use some tissue to remove the excess paint off on your brush so that effectively there's nothing on there, then just draw up a small amount from there. And this way, even though your brush looks like nothing's on it, you'll have the correct amount for what you need for the effect, because this needs to be subtle. You can always build it up through multiple coats, which will give a more convincing appearance, but it has to be thin coats all the while. And what we're going to do is just thinly apply this over the area where we'd get that hair growing. So that means the chin, and then going across the cheek just here, and then going up to the sideburn right there. then we need to bring some over where the moustache would be. So just there and then down the side. Now, ideally, the first pass isn't going to appear like anything's really happening, but because it's so thin, that's going to dry real quick, which means we can go in for a second coat, and this is going to build upon that subtle first coat and start to make it look a little bit deeper. So the second coat, you'll start to see it happening, and then from this point on, it's really entirely up to you how many passes you do. Each application will result in a stronger grey, so just carry on until you're happy. Here we have the completed effect, which I built up with 3 coats there to get to that sort of strength. But as I say, it's entirely up to you how many coats you apply. Just make sure that you don't get carried away so it goes too strong a grey. But once you're happy with that, the next thing to take a look at is painting the eyes. Now, when it comes to painting eyes, this is entirely optional and you certainly don't need to do it. And in fact, if you don't want to, what I recommend you do is just mix up a really dark brown, just run it into the recess of the eye to give the appearance that they're in shadow, and that's going to look great on the tabletop. But if you do really want to paint the eyes, then what you should do is start out with a black and then follow it up with a white. So I'm going to start with the black. Here I'm using some Doom Death Black, and for the white I'm going to be using some White Star. And throughout this what you'll need is the smallest brush you've got access to. So I'm using my size 00 once again. Starting out with that Doom Death Black, what we need to do is just get some of this thin down on the palette so it's quite inky. Just going to add that water into it there like that, so you can see I'm making quite a runny version of the black. And then like with that grey, just remove the excess, draw up a small amount there, and this way you'll have that nice tip on your brush. And with this then, we just need to run it into the eye. So what I like to do is to brace my hands together like this, approach in this direction on the eye, and with the tip of the brush, we just need to run it into that recess above that lower eyelid and beneath the brow. So just very gently in there to get a black line there like that. As for the other eye, just going to rotate the model a little bit and approach it in the same way. Again, just looking for that black line in the deepest recess. With that done, now comes the tricky bit, so it's time to move on to a pure white. Here I've got some White Star, and what we need to do is add 2 dots into each eye to create the illusion of a pupil. So that means just very gently moving in and putting a dot on the inside of the eye there like that, and then 1 on the outside. Now this bit is tricky, so usually on the first pass the eyes are going to be, well, not quite looking the same direction, so if that should happen, don't worry about it. Just let it dry, then go back in with the black and adjust as you need to until you're happy. And there we are, the eyes are completed, and I did have to adjust them ever so slightly to make sure that it looked correct, but now, well, let's face it, he looks really, really angry. So, well, with that done, what we can now do is move on to the next phase of painting the miniature, which is to do some layering. And here the goal is just to clean up some of the colours before we then move on to highlighting. We'll start by layering on the gold, and what this is going to do is return that shine to it. And what we should do here is go back to the original gold we used. So in our case, that's going to be Dragon's Gold. And to apply it, I'm going to be going back to my size 0 brush, which is a good size for the kind of thing we're doing here. What you need to do is just thin that gold down so it's a little bit thinner than it was when we did the original base coat. So we're looking about this sort of consistency here. And then we just need to apply a thin coat of this over all the gold that we originally base coated. So, for example, if we look at the shoulder plates, we're going to approach it in the same way that we did with the base coat, but the idea now is just to run that thin coat over the top so that we get some of that warmth still showing through from the wash that we did earlier, but by doing this, you can see it really brings that nice shine back to it. Now on the shoulder plates, it's quite simple because it's relatively flat going around here, but when you get to golden details that have got more texture to them and recesses, we just need to make sure we don't drop into those recesses. So if we look at this design on the chest, for example, around the U for the Ultramarine symbol, what we're going to do is go onto the flat of it, just like we did in the shoulder pad rims, but you can see I'm just being careful not to drop into that recess where we meet that wing, or even the recesses where we go up to that skull. So just making sure we've got that definition between the two. On the wing itself, just look for those raised up areas, and I'm just going to gently apply this again with the side of the brush just to make sure that we just pick out that texture, just slightly skimming downwards like this, just to bring out those feathers there like that. And there we are, that's a nice quick and easy stage to do, and you can see the results. We've got that shine back and all that gold, and it really brings back that ornate appearance there to the power armour. And so with that done, we can now move on to layering with 3 more colours. And the first of these is going to be the red. Here I'm returning to Sanguine Scarlet, and then we can do the same on the white, and in this case again I'm going to go back to the original colour, so Ivory Tusk in this case. Now with that done, we're then going to move on to the parchment and the bone, and here I'm going to go a little bit lighter to start to create a bit more contrast between the shadows and the lighter parts. So here I'm going to use some Skeleton Legion. But first of all, what we need to do is start with the red. So I'm going to use some Sanguine Scarlet, and to apply it, I'm sticking to the size 0 brush. And with this, we just need a small amount. Then we just need to return to those red details. So this is going to be the sword hilt and also this sunburst design we got on the shoulder just here. And what we need to do is just apply it onto the flat areas just here, whilst being careful not to drop into the recesses, such as just around this skull. Next up, it's time to return to some Ivory Tusk for the white details, and here I'm using the size 0 brush once again to apply this onto those raised up flatter areas such as the fabric right here, where I'm concentrating on where it crests out like this, but making sure not to drop into the recess where we've got shadows, such as just in there. Instead, just skip past and carry on again on the other side. When it comes to the small white part of armour that we've got down here with this Ultramarine symbol, in this case we just want to again avoid the recesses, so it's just a matter of layering it onto the flat parts in the middle, such as just around here. And then finally we can move on to layering the bone colour details, and here I'm going for some Skeleton Legion. Now to begin with the parchment, we're aiming to pick out all the raised up areas, and you can see we have this sort of creased texture here. So the idea is just to go across the parchment like this in this sort of motion, avoiding recesses as we go to retain that definition that we got from the shading. From the bone it's going to be the same general kind of process in that we're looking to avoid recesses. So we've got this little one just here, again just concentrate on the raised up areas and avoid the parts that are in shadow. And with that, the layering stage of painting Lieutenant Titus is now complete. And if you want to, you could now move on to applying the transfer onto his shoulder pad, then painting the base, and your miniature at this point is going to look fantastic on the tabletop. But if you want to take it further and help it really pop out, then highlighting is what you need to do. And so what we're now going to do is start the process of highlighting all the details on him. So if you want to do it, you can see how we do it. So what I'm going to be doing is starting out by highlighting the main colour of the model. It's always the best place to start. In this case, that's going to be the blue power armour. So what you need to do is choose a blue that's a bit lighter than the one you originally used. In my case, I'm going to be using some Elysium blue, and I'm going to be doing the edge highlighting technique here. So to do this, what you should do is pick your finest brush with the best tip on it. I'm going to use my size 00 for this one, and what you want to do is just make sure you get the paint thinned down on your palette so it's a little bit runny. And what we're looking for is the sweet spot where it flows easily from the brush, but not so easily that it runs out of control. So what I'm doing is just putting some water on the palette and pulling some of the paint into it. So even though this looks like one blob, it's actually two. I've got my thinned version right there and the main blob of pigment just there. And what I'm doing is just pulling more of that paint into it just to thicken things up from just that being water on its own until I reach that point. And it feels about the right stage just there. You can always test it by having a go at painting some lines on your palette. And if it flows easily from your brush like it's doing there, then you're at about the right point. So with that prepared, what I'm going to do is just remove excess paint off the brush because that mixing process will result in too much being in there. From this point we can draw up fresh, and this way we won't have too much paint on the brush. Just going to make sure I get some into the belly of it just there like that, and twisting the bristles to a nice point, we're then ready to go. So what we're now looking for are all the edges and angles that appear on the blue armour. And a lot of these, and in fact most of them, you can actually approach from the side of the brush at about a 45-degree angle from the flat, such as here on the knee. And what you do is just skim along like that, and you can see the results. You get that bright blue line following that edge, gives you a really nice highlight really quickly and easily. Now the key to doing this is to make sure that you change the angle of the model to make sure that your hand that's holding the brush is comfortable, because this way you'll be able to do that skimming motion and get those nice highlights really easily. So this means sometimes really turning the model around like this to make sure you get to those angles, but you can see doing so is definitely worth it, makes it nice and comfortable and quick to do things like this. Now, whilst you can do most of the edges like this on Primaris armour, you certainly won't be able to get to all of them because some of them are just too tricky to reach. And this panel we've got here on the side of the leg, that's one such example. There's basically just not enough room for me to use the side of the brush there. So here, I'm going to revert to using the tip of it. Now, I find an easy way to do this is to angle the model so that the line you're about to paint is just vertical, so you're looking straight down at it like this, and then you have a nice natural motion with your hand to follow that line with the tip of the brush there like that. And when you're doing this, just change the angle as you need to make sure you're always comfortable, and again, just follow that edge as neatly as you can. Now this step will easily be the longest stage of painting the entire miniature, but it's one that if you really take your time and get it as neat and as sharp as possible, it's going to make it look amazing. So just take your time, be as neat as you can, and work your way around that blue armour. And here he is with that first highlight applied, and as you can see it does make quite a stark difference and really helps all those panels and things stand out nicely, so it looks great on the tabletop, which is a really great advantage of this style of highlighting. And if you want to, you can now take it a little bit further. This is something you might just want to reserve to your characters, or you can do it with your whole army if you want to, but what you'll need here if you decide to do it is do a second edge highlight with a lighter blue, and this time you want a sort of like pale greyish blue. Now I'm going to use some gravestone blue for this, and to apply it once more I'm using that small brush, so back to the size 00, and whilst this is a similar application technique, it's now much more selective towards areas that are going to be catching the light or stand out. And basically what we're doing is using this lighter highlight to exaggerate those parts a little bit more. So just need to prepare this in the same way as we did with the previous colour, making sure the paint's nicely thinned down and under control on your brush. Again, being careful not to overload it, so just remove paint if you need to. And then with this, we can now look for those parts that do really stand out. And if we go to the leg around here, that's going to be things such as the top of this little bit of armour we've got on the knee. So we're just going to add a little graze of this across that brightest part there like that, just help it pop right there. We can also add a little bit on the tip of his foot. So just going down here with the tip of the brush, just adding a small amount just in that area there where the light catches a crescent right there like that. We can also do a little bit on the armour up here. So on the collar, again, this part in the gorget really stands out. So we can just add a bit of a highlight with that smooth motion, because doing it like this just blends it into that colour beneath. So now it's just a matter of going around looking for any features that really stand out like this and just push them a little bit further with this fine highlight. And once that's done, the blue armour is then complete, so it's time to move on to the next important features, which I find with Ultramarines tends to be the metallics, especially the gold because of all that shoulder pad trim. So what we'll do is highlight the gold now. In this case, what you need is more of a white gold colour, so I'm going to use glistening gold here. And once that's done, we'll move on to the silver and apply it in the same sort of way. In this case, I'm going to be using some mithril blade. But first of all, we need to go for the gold. So I'm using glistening gold here, and to apply it, I'm sticking to the size 00 brush because the application for this colour is going to be the same technique as what we just did with that blue. And that we're looking for all those edges and angles and things and just want to follow each one. So you need to make sure you thin that paint down just like we did before, being careful that it's not overloaded. And then it's time to start looking for all the gold details, such as the shoulder pad trim, which when it comes to the outside of it, is nice and easy to get to because we can do that trick where we use the side of the brush and just skim along it there like that to get that bright gold line, to get that sharp highlight along the edge. Now, of course, you won't always be able to approach like that, such as on the inside where things get a little bit trickier, but remember with this, just brace your hands so you're nice and steady and apply the colour in that downward motion with the tip of the brush to get a fine highlight on the inside as well. And once you're happy with that, you can then move on to highlighting the silver with a bright silver. So here I've got some mithril blade, and the application here is going to be once again identical to what we just did with the gold, and that we're looking for all those sharper edges and angles. Now also when you're doing the silver, there is one very fine detail that you can pick out now, and that is the service studs that he's got on his forehead. And for this, all you need to do is just brace your hands and just pick them out with a dot of this colour. And here we have the model with the metallics now applied, and you can see it's definitely worth taking the time there because it really just pushed the shine of those details. And so with that done, we can now move on to highlighting some of the smaller features, and begin by highlighting the black. And here what we want is a dark grey. So I'm going to start out with some dungeon stone grey. Then, like with the blue armour, if you want to, you can take it a little bit further as this is a character. And if you decide you want to do so, what you'll then need is a light grey. So here I'm going to use some Carcharodon grey. But we'll start out with the dark of the two. So this is dungeon stone grey, and to apply this one, again, I'm going for the size 00 brush because here again we're looking to accentuate any edges, any angles and things like that, but also we need to pick out the ridges of the undersuit of the armour as well. So having a brush like this with a fine point on it is really necessary here. So once the paint's thin and ready, and again after we made sure it's not overloaded, we can start looking for these features. And to begin with, for the weaponry, it's going to be an edge highlight just like we did with the armour, where possible we're looking to use the side of the brush to skim along the sharper edges, such as the top of the bolt pistol right there. Then also we want to pick out the various angles and things that appear elsewhere in the weapon, such as this part we got just in the front here, where I'm going to go in with the tip of the brush just to pick out that angle there like that. But when it comes to the joints in the armour, here we do need to be careful because it can be quite tricky getting to them. You can see what I mean with this one that we've got just beneath that little bit of fabric at the back just there. So make sure you're comfortable. Look for those little angles we've got in there, those creases almost in the undersuit, and then just pick out the parts that stand out with a little flash of this colour. Don't need very much, but it just helps bring out that texture. And once that's done, as an optional step, you can take the black a little bit further with a fine highlight with a light grey. So here I'm using some Carcharodon grey, and again it's an edge highlight. It's actually very much like the fine highlight we did in the blue, where we're now just looking for any features that really stand out and just graze a little bit this colour on those parts, just to help them pop that a little bit more. And there we are, the black is now completed too, so it's time to move on to highlighting the smaller features on the miniature. And what we'll do here is start out with the red. In this case, you want a nice bright red, so we're going to use some Demon Red. Now with that done, we can then highlight all the white features using a pure white now. So here I'm going to use some White Star, and with that done, we can move on to the purity seals. Now for the wax, you'll need a pink. Going to use some glistening gums here, and then for the parchment and also the bones at the same time, you'll want a light bone colour, and I'm going to use some Vampire Fang. Finally, what we need to do then is highlight the leather, and at the same time, we can actually get away with highlighting his hair, and here we'll need a nice sort of medium brown. And I'm going to use some Wasteland Brown for this. But first of all, we need the red, so I'm using some Demon Red, and to apply it, I'm again sticking to that small brush, so it's my size 00 once again. Don't need very much of this, just a small amount there on the brush, and then with this we've got to do the handle of his sword, and also this sunburst design that appears on the shoulder. Now this is going to be a little bit tricky to get to because the angles we need to hold the miniature in. You can see it's quite strange how I'm holding it, but this is just to keep things nice and steady so that we can follow the outline with a line of this colour. Next, we're ready to highlight the white details, so here you'll need a pure white. I'm using some White Star here, and to begin with for the fabric, we need to go around the outline of it, so with the side of the brush and just skimming along there and following it round, but not dipping quite into the deepest part of the creases, just bringing it down to about that point there, then carrying on and just onto the other side around there. We also want to add a highlight onto the very peak of the creases, so you can see one really stands out going down there, so what we're going to do is just in a downward motion, apply a bit of this colour onto that there as well. We also have the white knee pad to do, and this is just going to be a very small amount where we just need a little bit of white towards the top of it, just in there. We can now move on to a pink to highlight the purity seal wax. So here I'm using some glistening gums, still with that size 00 brush, and this is nice and easy. All you need to do is just look for the raised texture on the blobs of wax and just dot your brush on those to help pick them out. Once you've finished with the wax, it's then time to move on to the parchment. And here what you'll need is a light bone colour. Now I'm using some Vampire Fang for this, and for the parchment to begin with, we need to go around the outside edge just like this, being careful not to drop into any darker recesses. And once that's done, we can then use the tip of the brush just to pick out the peaks of the creases going along them. So for example, we've got just a few down here, there like that. There's one more right here. And then it's just 1 and 2 down there. Now in addition, we can use this colour to add a highlight onto the bone details too, where we're looking for the parts that really stand out, and it's just a matter of picking those out with a little bit of this colour. So for example, on this skull, we can go around the eye sockets, around the nose, and a little bit around the face right there. And there's one last thing that we could do with this colour, and that is to pick out Titus's teeth. For this, all you got to do is just brace the miniature to be as steady as possible and just go in and just allow your brush to pick out this part of the texture inside his mouth. And then finally, you need to grab yourself a medium brown and start out with, here we can highlight all the leather. So in this case, I'm using some Wasteland Brown, and this I'm going to be applying very much like an edge highlight. But as I do this, I'm just going to allow the brush just to dot along a little bit and just allow my hand just to shake ever so slightly. And the idea is to create quite a rough edge highlight. And what this will do is give the impression of a bit of texture there on the leather. So you can see as I go along the side of the holster, just dotting along a little bit there like that. And if you want to, you can take it further by every now and then just adding a few lines going across it to give the impression of some cracks. So for example, just a line going there like that. We're doing another one just there as well. Now we can also use this colour to highlight his hair, and in this case just look for the direction of the strands of it and just do some lines following along just to help bring out the texture up here as well. And there we are, all those details are now highlighted, so it's time to move on to a finishing touch, which is going to be to add some script onto the Purity Seal parchment. And for this, what I recommend you go for is a dark warm brown. So I'm going to be using some Cuirass Leather here, and to apply it, you definitely want to go for your finest brush. So I'm going back to my size 00. And with this, basically what we're aiming to do is just to do some squiggles on the parchment to give the impression of some text. Now the trick is to make sure you thin the paint down so it's quite inky. So you can see I've added quite a bit of water and only got a small amount of paint there, so I've got a very runny version of the paint. And then as usual, going to make sure I don't have much of it on the brush so that we retain that fine point. And then with this, the idea is to brace your hands as steady as possible and just work your way down the parchment doing some little wiggly lines. So if you look at this one just here, I'm just going to start at this point and just allow my hand to shake as I work my way across and work my way down. And what this will do is give the impression of text going down that parchment paper there like that. Now, if you're feeling brave, you can also add the word Ultra onto that scroll that's designed on his shoulder plate just around here. Now, this isn't as tricky as it first appears because these purity seals actually cover quite a lot of it, so you don't have to write the whole word. Instead, what I do is start out with the end in a case like this. So it's going to be an A, which we just need to line in right there. So there we go, just a fine A, just in that position right there. Then on the front, we can add a U. So that's going to be around here, and again, partially obscured. So really you only need to do one side of it, which is going to be a curve going around there. So there we go. And then all we've got to do is add in a little bit of an R just in here. Now with this done, you're then ready to apply the Ultramarine transfer onto the other shoulder pad, and then it's time to base your miniature. As ever, it's entirely up to you what basing scheme you go for, but I'm going to be going for an urban rubble base. And with the base now fully painted, Lieutenant Titus is complete and ready to go to war in the name of the God Emperor and kill lots and lots of Tyranids. So as you've seen, painting Lieutenant Titus is very straightforward, and like many Space Marines, a model like this really rewards a neat and tidy paint style. So just remember to take your time and be as neat as you can, especially if you decide to do the highlights, particularly on the blue armour. Here, if you get them nice and sharp as you're applying those highlights, then your model's really going to pop nicely on the tabletop. Now, whilst it was Lieutenant Titus that we really focused on in this video, all the methods and techniques we've shown you here can be applied to just about any Ultramarine you might want to paint. So have fun painting your Ultramarines, and we'll see you again very soon.